All
and
right.
read a lot of
Hello.
stuff
We
all
read
over
a
the
lot of stuff. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Sam and Hank are here together. We have a lot to go through today. This episode is going to be mostly on the life and biography of Athanasius. This is our third episode on Athanasius. We did two episodes on the incarnation and against the heathen, which were Athanasius's early works. This episode will focus mostly on his biography, the events of his life, but also the middle writings, I guess you could say, the writings that he wrote after he was a young man, but before the end of his life writings. And we'll also probably have one final episode where we talk about kind of the final theology, I guess, the mature theology of Athanasius that he writes at the end of his life. And I think that the final writings of Athanasius are a candidate for the writings that are sort of the first real Trinitarian documents, I would say. If you were to ask the question, who is the first full-fledged Orthodox Trinitarian in history, Athanasius might be about the right answer, but I think it takes him a while to get there. I don't think it would be quite right to say that early Athanasius was a full-fledged Orthodox Trinitarian, but later Athanasius might be. And then there's a couple other candidates for that. But for now, we get to talk about Athanasius's life, which is not boring. So, Hank, what do you have to say before I try and question the validity of the sainthood of Athanasius?
I mean, I think that as we get into Athanasius, Sam, we're going to start to see that his life has a lot of the travails that your life has.
Yeah, except I haven't killed anybody. I haven't desecrated any churches. I haven't threatened millions of people with starvation. But other than that, Athanasius and I have a lot in common.
Millions of people. Well, I mean, booted out of a lot of churches.
Yeah,
You've been in the spiritual desert a few times.
I've been in the spiritual desert a few times. Yeah, Athanasius, I guess he's been excommunicated more times than I have, so I should try and sympathize with him that way. Although I find him a hard man to sympathize with, mostly because I think that Athanasius, more than just about any person in history, came to imbue the church with this sort of propositional brittleness and exclusivity around these questions that I think has left a bad legacy for the church ever since. And I feel like when I am asking questions around the topic of the Trinity in churches or in other places and I get cold treatment, it's almost as if I can feel the spirit of Athanasius alive and well in some of these people, and I don't think it's a great spirit. So,
No, I would want to correct you, Sam, that that's just Protestantism writ large.
well, so if I went to the Catholic Church and said, "Hey, here's what I believe. Could you let me in, please?" What sort of reception would that yield?
Well, probably better than at a Protestant church. I mean,
That
you know,
might actually be true.
well, one can only look at our current pope and say that the Catholic Church seems to be a little more open to, shall we
The-
say, theological ambiguity.
Oh, okay. So maybe I could just go in with some theological ambiguity to the local Catholic Church, and as long as I say the right things, then I could get in.
I wake up every morning wondering what new teaching the Pope is going to have and when he's going to walk it back.
Well, speaking of people who never walked anything back, one thing I will say that I admire about Athanasius, before we get into the details of his biography, is that he was very zealous for the truth. I don't think anyone, enemy or friend, would doubt that Athanasius was sincere about what he believed and that he cared very passionately that the church get the doctrine of God correct. I think his actions only make sense in the light of him being a very zealous person. I think zeal is a good word for Athanasius. Was he very Christ-like? maybe not, but was he very committed to defending the truth and willing to take the consequences of standing up for what he believed to be right? Yes, he was. And so that's something that I can admire, even if there's a lot that I don't admire. All right, so Athanasius, he was born in 296 AD, or was it 299 AD? That's a relevant question for later in his biography. He was born in Alexandria, Egypt. I got some people saying he was born to Christian parents, some people saying he was born to pagan parents. I don't think anyone quite totally knows, but he probably grew up on the prosperous side of Alexandria, was decently well educated, and got connected with the church at a pretty early age. By 318 AD, so when he's either a late teenager or early in his 20s, he's a deacon of the church in Alexandria. Specifically, the Bishop Alexander seems to have taken him under his wing as a protege and seems to have seen, I guess, potential in Athanasius and recruited him as his sort of protege and ally. In 318 AD, that same year he gets appointed deacon, there erupts conflict between Alexander and Arius. Alexander is giving a series of sermons and teachings, especially I think his first deliverance of his ideas and theology came at a gathering of bishops and clergymen in Alexandria. And that Alexander gives a series of sermons that really emphasize the equality and eternality of the Son to the Father. Arius gives a series of counter sermons, not liking this theological idea, and this causes Alexander to excommunicate Arius. I won't go over this too much because we've already covered this kind of like 2 or 3 times. If you care a lot about this, specifically our episode about Arius would be even more relevant. So Alexander excommunicates Arius. Arius returns to Alexandria in 322 AD with letters from other bishops and councils that command Alexander to readmit Arius into communion. Alexander refuses the orders of these other bishops, and street violence erupts. And this is sort of the first time, because this is very early in the newly Christian period of the empire, right? 313 AD, Constantine had issued the Edict of Milan. So we finally have some Christian tolerance in the empire, but it doesn't take very long for Christians are starting to turn against each other and commit acts of violence against each other. And Alexandria is sort of the center place of this conflict. In 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea is convened, and one of the main purposes of the Council of Nicaea is to address this Arian conflict in Alexandria. Athanasius attends. In a previous episode, I had said that Athanasius likely wasn't at the Council of Nicaea. I think upon further research, I will correct that. It seems like the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of Athanasius having, in fact, been at the Council of Nicaea. He is sort of like Alexander's assistant or secretary or page, or however you want to put that, at the Council of Nicaea. People think that Athanasius was sort of like the hero of the Council of Nicaea. He's like a mid-20-year-old, right? He's in the shadow of his bishop, who is the main leader of the anti-Arian side of the Council of Nicaea, is Bishop Alexander. And Bishop Alexander and his allies mostly win the Council of Nicaea with a creed that favors their theology and is strongly condemning of Arian theology. Arius and a few of his allies get excommunicated at the Council of Nicaea. All of this is sort of history that we've covered a couple times. I'm just restating it here to just set the context. All right. So in 328, this is a couple years after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine hears a creed from Arius and declares Arius orthodox. He sends Arius to Alexandria with a letter from Constantine commanding that he be readmitted to communion and reappointed to his church. And Athanasius is sent by Alexander to Constantinople, where Constantine is with Arius, to plead the case of Alexander and plead the case that Arius should not be readmitted to communion. While this is happening in Constantinople, while Athanasius and Arius and Constantine are in Constantinople trying to sort this out, Bishop Alexander dies of natural causes. He was an old man, like maybe in his 70s or 80s at that point in time. And this news reaches Constantinople, and Athanasius gets on the fastest boat he can from Constantinople to get back to Alexandria, because he knows there's going to be a political food fight over who gets to be the next bishop of Alexandria, since Alexander has died. There was a schism in the Alexandrian church that will haunt Athanasius for most of his life, called the Meletian Schism. The Meletians, like right before the Edict of Milan, there was some persecution. There was the Diocletian persecution, which was a pretty severe persecution. And oftentimes when there was a period of persecution, there would be hardcore people who would stay in the city and suffer the consequences of the persecution. And there would be people who would flee the city, or people who would give in to persecution. And then after the persecution was over, it would be hard for these two groups to get back together, because the hardcore people viewed the softcore people as traitors, and the softcore people viewed the hardcore people as unreasonable. And so the hardcore people in this case in Egypt were the Meletians. And oftentimes during the persecution, when the normal clergy has left the city, they have to appoint their own clergy and appoint new bishops, appoint new priests, baptize people, etc. And then when the bishops return, it's like, were those appointments legitimate or not? And that created this fissure that lasts in the Alexandrian church for decades. And so the Meletians want to appoint a new bishop of Alexandria this is in 328 AD again, that is amenable to both sides. But Athanasius doesn't like this idea. He gathers a small group of his loyalists. They sneak into the main church and they consecrate Athanasius as Bishop of Alexandria without the full approval of all the bishops of Alexandria. Also, I mentioned, when was Athanasius born? So there is a longstanding rule in the church at this point. There aren't a lot of rules in the church, but one of the rules is you have to be 30 years old to be a bishop. If Athanasius was born in 296 AD, this isn't a problem, because that would make him 31 or 32. If Athanasius was born in 299 AD, this would be a problem, because that would make him 29 years old. And so one of the accusations that haunts Athanasius for the rest of his life is that he was appointed Bishop of Alexandria improperly, because they rushed it, and also improperly on the account that he was perhaps not yet 30 years old. So what do you think of that, Hank?
Oh my gosh, the horror. I think that obviously Alexandria is the central location of some very strong personalities and leaders in the church. Probably I think if you're Constantine, Alexandria is a city that you wish didn't exist. Okay? Because it's nothing but trouble. Whether it's through the Arians or or Athanasius, right? And his people. Just to clarify, your tribe, Sam, really isn't even a player in this issue, is it?
No. So the main fight, starting from this period onwards, is between the Arians and the Athanasians.
Yep.
And we've covered the difference before, but it should be stated in this episode again, just for clarity. The main theological issue is the relationship between the Father and the Son. It would not be correct to say it was a argument between Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians. The word Trinity, it's used a little bit, although interestingly, Athanasius in his writings, I think I searched, and he uses the word Trinity about 4 times in the sum total of all of his works. And 3 of the times that he uses the word Trinity is when he's quoting Arius, who used the word Trinity. So it's not like Athanasius is running around, we need to defend the doctrine of the Trinity. The Trinity is under attack. That just wasn't the vocabulary of the day. The idea that there was a doctrine of the Trinity, that's an anachronistic phrase that we view the conflict through now, but that wasn't the way that they thought of it then. Almost the entirety of the conflict was, how is the Father related to the Son? And what status does the Son of God have relative to God the Father? An Athanasian or an Alexandrian or a pro-Nicene or an anti-Arian, whatever label you want to use for that camp, would have said that the Son is eternal as opposed to beginning to exist at a certain point in time, that the Son of God has the same quality and level of divinity as God the Father. There isn't a different kind of divinity, that the Son of God, therefore, is worthy of like equal worship and equal glory and equal praise. But they would still say that God the Father, in a certain sense, is higher than the Son of God, because God the Father is unoriginate, he's unbegotten, but the Son of God is begotten of God. So it's still God the Father is the source of the Son, but that they're very equal. Whereas an Arian would have said that the Son of God is begotten of God at a certain point of time. It doesn't make sense to be begotten if there wasn't a time when you were begotten. And that, of course, the Son of God is subordinate to God the Father because he's begotten of God. And so they aren't equal in glory, aren't equal in praise. And therefore, also God the Father is of a higher level of divinity than the Son of God. But both of them would have, both the Arians and the anti-Arians are actually way more similar to each other than we often give them credit for. They both believe that the Son of God was the Logos who created everything else. Both the Arians and the anti-Arians think that God created the world through the Son of God. It's just, how did this happen in sequence? Both believe in the pre-existence of Christ, that before Jesus was a human being, before he was incarnate, he was the Son of God, and that he then voluntarily became incarnate in the Virgin Mary. Both of them agree about that sort of thing. And both of them agree in some sense that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are very strongly connected and important, and in some sense a triad or a trinity, and in some sense they're the one God, but just how exactly you connect the dots in that was the source of the disagreement. So I think that people often think that Arius was basically like me, where he didn't think that Jesus was God at all. But Arius and his allies constantly called Jesus divine. They just thought that he was divine in a secondary sense compared to the sense that God the Father was divine.
Right. And actually, as I read Athanasius, his expository writings would be more directed, even though he doesn't know it at times, at Paul of Samosata.
Yeah.
So if you read on Luke 10:22 and Matthew 11:17, or when he quotes Irenaeus of Lyon saying, "So then the Father is Lord, the Son is Lord, and the Father is God, and the Son is God, for that which is begotten of God is God." Okay, so that's Athanasius quoting Irenaeus of Lyon, and then of course Athanasius goes to Isaiah 9:6, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which names the names of Jesus, and one of them is what?
Mighty God.
Yes, mighty
Mm-hmm.
God. Okay.
Or is it God is mighty?
You know what? Did God really say? But you know, I looked at 4 or 5 different translations, and they're all translated as mighty God, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And that's how he reads it, as mighty God.
Although the Arians were often way more okay with that than we often give them
Yeah.
credit for.
Right.
Yeah.
This is not really honestly, this is not a shot at Arians.
Yeah.
It's a shot at Paul of Samosata.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what's funny is what you have is really and look, you know, you'll sit there and smile, but we know both the Catholic and Protestant Church, if you were to grill most of the people, 50% of the people that go to both, most of them would say Jesus is the Son of God, but he's man. Okay? That's not an Arian heresy. That's Paul Samosata.
Right.
Okay? And most people wouldn't understand. The people that seem to understand Arian heresy are the best are Catholic theologians who read Christian history and have read Athanasius and whatever there is of Arius. And so what you have is an issue of, oh yeah, there was preexistence, but he was begotten. He's not of the highest order of God, right?
Yeah.
And of course, someone like me would say, so what do we have? We have three gods then? Because you're telling me there's God, and then there's a lower God. Sort of like, here's Zeus, here's Apollo, here's Hercules.
Mm.
Now, that's, I think, if I look at the time, that's what Athanasius is fighting, is saying you're going back to a Greek understanding of who gods are. Where
really,
Paul Samosata didn't actually do that. Well, Paul Samosata did. I'm trying to steal man, Paul Samosata said, no, there's only one God. Jesus was man, who had a special relationship with God, and is his name, you can call on his name to be saved. Do I have that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. But he was not God.
Right. And the Logos is a power that God puts inside Jesus to work through. The Logos isn't a person.
Right.
It's like God's speaking power and truth that is dwelling inside a human being.
I mean, honestly, Arius' conception of God, the Trinity, is sort of pantheistic. And that's where, Athanasius gets going. Now, I think let's go into Athanasius. Athanasius led, shall we say, a very colorful life. Is that a good way of saying that, Sam?
He leads a colorful life. All right. So let's pick up the story again. I guess I'll just make one last comment on the theology. I think really sometimes the Arians and the anti-Arians can get so close to each other that it's hard to tell them apart. And the differences sometimes seem very minor. It's okay, so was the Son of God eternally begotten, or was he the begotten before time? Well, it's wait a minute, what's actually the difference between those two things when you get down to brass tacks? To me, it seems all right, you guys are arguing about angels on a pinhead, but I think that the main difference is that the Athanasians always wanted their instinct was to protect the divinity of Jesus. And an Arian's instinct was to protect the uniqueness of God the Father. And that those are really the two instincts that are in tension. And the Arians will be like, hey, you Athanasians, if you make Jesus that divine, then you've got two equal gods. Whereas if we have a hierarchy, yeah, we're saying that Jesus is a God, but we can still be monotheist because there's one chief God up top. But if you're saying that the Son of God is equal to the God up top, then you've got two gods equally up top, and that's polytheism. And I think that pressure on the Athanasians to want Jesus and the Father to be equal, but the need to be monotheistic, is what eventually that Arian criticism of their instincts eventually causes them to have to figure out that they're going to need to wrap the Son and then eventually the Holy Spirit into one God together. And that really is what sort of forges or, forms the doctrine of the Trinity in the later half of the 4th century, is Arian pushback against the Athanasian defense of the divinity of the Son. That's how I would put it. All right. Picking up again in 328 AD. So Athanasius has hastily and perhaps underage got himself appointed the Bishop of Alexandria. And he's wasting no time in trying to get Alexandria subordinate to his rule. And one of the problems, like I mentioned, is these Miletians who are orthodox theologically. He never criticizes their theology, but they sort of have this parallel church structure to him, and they've appointed people that he hasn't appointed. They're not fully subordinate to him as the Bishop of Alexandria. And so in 330 AD, the Meletian bishops write a letter to Eusebius of Nicomedia and Constantine. Eusebius of Nicomedia, I should mention, is actually the leader of the Arians. Arius himself was not really the leader of the Arians. Arius was just a presbyter in exile. He didn't really have much political power. Eusebius of Nicomedia was the bishop of Nicomedia, which was the imperial capital at the time, and was a strong ally of Constantine. So he was the actual leader of the Arian party. And you'll actually notice in a lot of Athanasius's letters, he doesn't use the phrase Arians, he uses the phrase Eusebians, and he's referring to the party of Eusebius and Nicomedia. So the Miletian bishops are appealing to Athanasius's enemies, and they accuse Athanasius of sending henchmen to their church, and these henchmen broke a communion chalice and overturned an altar. And so this chalice, which was used to serve the wine for communion, I think was supposed to have had consecrated wine in it. And they came over and knocked that over and broke the chalice. And this would be considered a form of desecration, right? This isn't just a violent act. This is a blasphemous act because it was desecrating something holy. And then they also accused him of extortion, where he would ask the Miletians to pay them goods and money that they didn't actually owe him. His election didn't follow proper procedure, and he was likely underage, and that Athanasius, had been participating in bribery of imperial officials to get his way. These are the accusations that they lay against him. A couple years later, in 332,
he was cleared of all charges.
Athanasius was so I think that Constantine has an interesting relationship to Athanasius. I think Constantine can appreciate that. I think Athanasius, more than anyone else, realizes that we are in a new age of the church, right? A lot of the bishops are older than him because he's appointed a bishop at a very young age, perhaps too early of an age. And Athanasius has grown up in the Constantinian age, where the church is not persecuted, but the church is becoming more and more empowered. Whereas a lot of the bishops are from the previous age, where they're used to the church being persecuted and not having much actual political power. And Athanasius is figuring out how bishops can actually now use imperial power to accomplish what they want. And I think that Constantine kind of admires that about him. Even though Constantine doesn't like it when Athanasius causes him problems, he does sort of he can see a fellow politician, and he can appreciate another fellow savvy politician. And I think Constantine sees some camaraderie in Athanasius in his ability to get things done and to use power to accomplish your goals and purposes. So in 332 AD, Athanasius appears before Constantine, and he does his usual stick where he's like, oh, that's just the Arians. They don't like my theology. They're making these things up. This is just a ploy to make me look bad. Also, by the way, I will do these things if I need to, but I didn't do them. I'm perfectly innocent. I love God, but if I need to, I would have done it. Like this two-faced sort of thing. This happens all the time in Athanasius's career. It's like, I would never do those things, but I certainly did do them. And if I need to do them, I would. But of course I didn't do them. So Athanasius is cleared of these charges by Constantine. Athanasius is then charged again 2 years later. And this time they bring the additional charge that he ordered the murder of a fellow bishop. So in 335 AD, an investigative team is sent to Alexandria by Constantine to investigate these charges. In 335 AD, there is a gathering of bishops in Jerusalem, but also sort of in Tyre in Lebanon, to celebrate the consecration of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. At this gathering of bishops, Arius is readmitted to communion again. The bishops hear from the investigative team. So they basically hire Robert Mueller to investigate Athanasius. There's basically a special counsel, appointed to investigate him. The team said that their investigation was difficult because Athanasius tampered with and intimidated witnesses on the investigative team. Athanasius had brought thugs to this gathering of bishops in Tyre that were constantly harassing and disrupting the proceedings. Athanasius claimed, so this is what I think is hilarious. So Athanasius, right, has been charged with ordering his henchmen to break this chalice and disrupt this church service. And his defense is, look, those were Miletian priests. They weren't rightfully appointed, so therefore that chalice wasn't holy. He's not denying that he sent henchmen to break up their church service and that the chalice was broken. He's just denying that it was a holy chalice because he's saying that this was an illegal gathering of church people. So he was charged with violence and blasphemy, and he says, no, that wasn't blasphemy, which is, kind of admitting to the violence half. Athanasius is found guilty on multiple charges and ordered deposed from his bishopric in Alexandria. Athanasius escapes by night and sails straight to Constantinople, again to appeal to Constantine. Athanasius gets to Constantine just a few hours before a boat carrying Eusebius of Nicomedia arrives. Athanasius gets Constantine to accept his case, which basically means that it nullifies the verdict that this gathering of bishops had come to. Eusebius then arrives in the harbor and marches straight to the palace where Athanasius is already in dialogue with Constantine. Eusebius then accuses Athanasius of threatening the grain supply of parts of the empire that were Arian and sending the grain instead to parts of the empire that were in favor of him. Constantine goes ballistic because you have to imagine at this point in time, Egypt is the largest grain exporter, and the food supply and the food security of large parts of the empire depends on food that comes out of Egypt. And that if parts of the empire are getting deprived of food from Egypt, they'll literally starve to death. This would be like if the bishop of Saudi Arabia were sending oil to some parts of the world that were in favor of the policies of Saudi Arabia, but not sending the oil to other parts, and that could cause economic turmoil. Something along those lines, right? Because the empire doesn't run on oil, it runs on food. Constantine goes, but you might wonder, like, hey, Eusebius, if Athanasius had done this, why didn't you bring that up at the Council of Tyre that was held when we were accusing Athanasius of all these things? If that accusation was true, why didn't you bring that up then? I think that Eusebius knows that Athanasius is a wily fox and that you don't play all of your cards at once. You play only as many cards against him as you need, and you hold the heavy cards in your back pocket for the exact right time. And I think that he had held this accusation against Athanasius in his hand until he was in front of Constantine and he couldn't escape. And so Constantine goes ballistic at Athanasius, saying, you did what? Are you really threatening the grain supply of the regions of the empire that favor the Arians? And Athanasius loses his cool, yells at Constantine, yells at Eusebius, saying, this is a silly accusation. And one should not yell at Constantine. That's a pretty bad idea. And Constantine banishes him on the spot and puts him on a boat and sends him to Trier, Germany. And
hence why we have bad German theology to this day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or was that the biblical Unitarians that gave us bad German theology?
Well, so Athanasius has to spend a couple years in Trier, Germany. Although because Constantine did this hastily, it's actually unclear who the Bishop of Alexandria is. It's not like he appointed a new Bishop of Alexandria. So there's a couple years in limbo here where there isn't really a Bishop of Alexandria, and Athanasius is in exile in Germany. And remember, at this point in time, Trier, Germany is a frontier fort. It's basically a fort that is defending the Rhine River against the German barbarians. So it's not a particularly pleasant place to be. You know who else is from Trier, Germany? Karl Marx is from Trier, Germany, and grew up in the same town that Athanasius was banished to. So
Wow.
maybe Marxism comes from Athanasius's theology that had been left over from his days in exile there.
I will not deign to answer that horrible accusation, sir.
Yeah. So, like, to make sure that this isn't just Sam who's saying some of these things about Athanasius being a little bit violent, here's a quote from a book by a leading historian of Athanasius. Despite his protestations of innocence, Athanasius exercised power and protected his position in Alexandria by the systemic use of violence and intimidation. The Papyrus of 335 documents in detail one small episode in which he coerced his opponents and used violence in an attempt to prevent them from attending a church council. This was not an isolated misdemeanor, but a typical example of the means by which bishops of Alexandria maintained their power in the Christian Roman Empire. If the violence of Athanasius leaves fewer traces in the surviving sources than similar behavior by later bishops of Alexandria like Theophilus, Cyril, and Dioscorus, the reason is not that he exercised power in a different way, but that he exercised it more efficiently and that he was more successful in presenting himself to posterity as an innocent and an honest, sincere, straightforward man of God than his successors. So, like I was telling Hank before the microphone was on, I think that Athanasius would have made an excellent mayor of Chicago or an excellent Ayatollah of Iran. This combination of needing to look good on the outside but exercising power beneath the surface is...
Hold on. Ayatollahs never care how they look, sir.
Well, you have to look holy and scary at the same time. It's a hard balancing act. You have to intimidate your enemies so that your enemies have to know that you are willing to do bad things, but you also have to look innocent enough to other people so that you don't get in trouble. It's a very tight rope to walk, and few people were able to walk that tightrope better than Athanasius.
I think maybe a better politician to compare Athanasius to, given your feelings about him, would be former President Obama.
Oh, no, I think that the right politician to compare Athanasius to is Hillary Clinton.
No, there's a difference. Hillary never got elected.
Fair enough. But, Hillary Clinton's opponents, don't seem to have very long longevities. But, you can never quite pin her down and get her in trouble.
Yeah.
This is the sort of thing that we're talking about.
Yeah, let's put it this way. I will say this. Being an enemy of Hillary Clinton, a significant enemy, usually reduces your actuarial life expectancy quite a bit.
Yeah, and being an enemy of Athanasius had a similar effect. All right, so
we're not sure of that. That's hearsay and gossip from one historian, Peter Barnes.
It's just the Arians making it up. Just the Arians making up all these accusations. I'm sure that the Arians were just completely false and lied all the time. They never had anything true to say about Athanasius. I'm sure that's the case.
You're starting to get with the program.
All right. So Athanasius is in Germany in exile for 2 years. Constantine dies. He is baptized on his deathbed by Eusebius of Nicomedia, right? The leading Arian, the leading anti-Athanasian is the bishop who baptizes Constantine. Constantine leaves his 3 sons in charge. Constantinus, Constantius, and Constans are the names of his 3 sons. So if this gets a little bit confusing, it's because everyone has a name that is some weird recombobulation of the word Constantine. And it's a little hard to keep track of all these people. And so because Constantine dies, all the people that he had exiled are allowed to return to where they're from. So, but Athanasius doesn't go straight back to Alexandria as soon as Constantine dies. He's got to rally his troops a little bit first. He has to strengthen his position before he can return, or else it would be too dangerous. So he spends the next couple months sailing all over the Roman Empire, drumming up support from people he knows who are sympathetic to him before he returns to before he returns to Alexandria, because he can't return with too weak a hand, or he might get killed, or or deposed, or some combination of those things. So Athanasius returns to Alexandria, and there are the usual riots. Who knows how many people die and these sorts of things, but he's basically able to force himself back into power. And his enemies are holding councils that condemn and depose him, but he'll convenes his own councils. That all of the councils that Athanasius convenes show that he's completely innocent of all of these charges, and that he is in fact the rightful Bishop of Alexandria, appointed perfectly rightfully. And so it's just the Arians that are making up these things. But it's a complicated situation, because, all right, so you can get a council over here of like a dozen bishops who will depose him, but then he can get his own council of a couple dozen bishops who will support him. And so there's this weird situation where no one can quite get enough power to either get rid of him or keep him there.
And by the way, that's why we always need the Roman Church, to make sure that we get these warring factions to have peace with each other.
That actually is a result of these couple decades of this sort of thing, is that there's a growing need for a centralized authority. So it can't just be, well, your council said this, my council said this, therefore they, nullify each other. And the bishop that starts to play increasingly that mediating role is the Bishop of Rome. So this does start to elevate the status of the Bishop of Rome as these sorts of disputes around Athanasius and other sorts of people. All right, in 339 AD, the anti-Athanasians, or the Arians, or the Eusebians, whatever you want to call them, gather a council, and they have the Emperor Constantius. So if you remember, there were three sons. One of the sons gets killed pretty quickly, and basically Constantius is the Emperor of the East, and Constans is the Emperor of the West. And so Constantius, the Emperor of the East, and remember Alexandria is basically in the East at this point, convenes a council, and so the emperor is there and some bishops are there. Athanasius is condemned again for breaking the chalice, again for violence against people that are against him, and for killing people, and for returning to Alexandria without proper permission from the empire. And Gregory of Cappadocia is appointed the new bishop of Alexandria by the bishops present. And Athanasius escapes this situation and sails to Rome. When Gregory, this new bishop, enters Alexandria, churches are desecrated, pagans are running through, virgins are raped, things are burned, there's looting, there's huge violence. Athanasius blames this new Arian bishop for doing all this violence. The Arians say that it was a false flag operation, and that Athanasius had paid some pagans to intentionally loot his own churches to make the Arians look bad. And he said, she said, you can pick your adventure on who you think is more trustworthy in that situation. But basically from 340 AD to 346 AD, Athanasius is in Rome. The Bishop Julius is supportive of Athanasius and is sort of gathering these exiles. So the East is increasingly exiling pro-Nicene bishops, and they go to Rome for safe haven. And so it's basically becoming the case that the eastern part of the empire is Arian, and the western part of the empire is the collection of the anti-Arians. And so Athanasius is in safe harbor in Rome. And he does a lot of writing at this time. He also cozies up to, a bunch of rich widows in Rome to get money and support. And, I'm sure that was perfectly, unimpeachable in his behavior with these elderly widows in Rome, just, fundraising and that sort of thing.
So he sounds like Rick Warren at Saddleback.
Yeah. Basically. In 343 AD, there's a council that is supposed to help the East and West get along, but they can't agree to the terms to have a proper council. The East condemns Athanasius, the West supports Athanasius, etc. But it basically leads to an increasing sense that this is becoming an East versus West dispute instead of just a dispute within Alexandria. In 450 and 340 and 345 AD, Gregory of Cappadocia, the person who had been appointed Bishop of Alexandria by the Emperor Constantius, he dies. Constans, who's the Emperor of the West, has been pressuring Constantius, the Emperor of the East, to allow Athanasius to return. And Athanasius returns and is again the Bishop of Alexandria. And then there's a period of relative peace where he actually gets to be the Bishop of Alexandria for a while. Athanasius is one of those people who decreases in popularity when he's in power because he's a thug, and increases in popularity when he's out of power and he can claim to be the victim of his persecutors. That sort of reminds me, it's like Donald Trump kind of too, right? When Donald Trump is actually president, he kind of loses popular support, but when he's not in power and he can just whine about being persecuted, he gets more sympathy.
You know what? How come we always have to bring in the orange fool?
Well, we've compared Athanasius to Barack Obama, to Hillary Clinton, and now to Donald Trump, so it seems only fair that...
Well, I guess that's the trinity of bad characters right there.
Yeah, so... let's see here what happens. So in 350 AD, Constans, this emperor of the West, who had been pressuring his brother to allow Athanasius to be in power, gets killed by an attempted coup. And there's a series of civil wars now. And after the civil wars, Constantius, who had previously just been the emperor of the East, now emerges in control of the whole empire, but it took a couple years of civil war to get him to reach that position. And Constantius, because he's the emperor of the East, is sort of a strong Arian supporter. And he convenes a series of councils that successfully increase Arian control in the empire, consolidate it in the East, and are starting to spread Arian power in the West. And so Athanasius, who's currently sitting in Alexandria, is getting increasingly nervous by this situation.
So let's stop here for a second. You would expect with the political heft of the emperor, basically the East is really where the power of the empire lies.
Yes.
Why isn't the church today Arian?
Well, because they have a couple decades of success, but the tides will turn against them in the later part of the 4th century. But if you were to go back in time,
but that's not Athanasius that's turning the tide. Why is the tide turning?
Why is the tide turning in favor of the Arians?
No, we know why that is.
Oh,
okay, you just told me why that is. You have the Eastern bishops combined with the emperor, who's an Arian. Yeah. Who's pushing it throughout the whole empire. But then, remember, Athanasius dies in 373, okay? Yeah. So who's pushing back sort of the vanguard of the Arian? So if you look at the Arians taking more and more geography, right? Sort of like maybe the Germans, okay?
Yeah.
Why?
The tide turns in about the late 360s against if you were to go back to the 350s and you would have forecasted who would win, it would look like the Arians were going to win. Yep. And that the Christian church would be cemented as Arian for posterity.
Right.
And so this period of the 350s is really the Arians' strongest decade for the reasons that you just mentioned. In 350, what happens? No, Athanasius is about to get exiled again. In 355 and 356 AD, Constantius is putting pressure on Athanasius to leave voluntarily. And Athanasius is not the sort of guy who goes down without a fight. So Athanasius is again like, I'm a perfectly innocent person. I would never do anything wrong. But if you put too much pressure on me, you know what will happen. Right, he's doing the left hand, right hand sort of business, and Constantius finally brings in the military and removes Athanasius by force in 356 AD, and Athanasius escapes to the monasteries in the desert of Egypt. And you might say, well, why wouldn't Constantius just chase him into the monasteries? Well, first off, it's not like these things are super easy to find on a map. they're hidden in the desert of Egypt, and that it also probably wouldn't be a great look for the emperor to bring a military to a monastery. And that these monasteries have been pro-Athanasian for a while. Athanasius has done a very careful job of cultivating his relationship with St. Anthony of the Desert, right? We did an episode of St. Anthony on the Desert. He's like the most famous monk at the time and really started monasticism in Egypt. And so that when Athanasius will do this multiple times, when he needs to escape Alexandria, either for a long time or a short period of time, he'll go and hide in the monasteries in the desert, and they'll hide him and protect him. And that because of St. Anthony's stellar reputation as a saint, you don't want to bring a military to the monastery to disrupt what they're doing. And like, if he's at the monastery, he's kind of out of Alexandria, and that's like close enough. That's good enough, right? You know, the emperor, if you can get him out of Alexandria, you know, okay, whatever. I have what I need. If he's hiding at that monastery in the desert, he's out of my hair, and I'm not going to chase him all the way there. So Athanasius goes and runs and hides in the monastery. And then George of Cappadocia, not Gregory of Cappadocia, that was the last one. George of Cappadocia gets appointed Bishop of Alexandria, and he's an Arian bishop. In 359 AD, the Council of Sirmium is convened, and this is the largest council in the 4th century, probably, in terms of attendance. It's bigger than the Council of Nicaea. It's bigger than the Council of Constantinople, which is where the creed actually that you guys still recite comes from. The largest council in the 4th century is this Council of Sirmium. And so we'll probably spend some more time on these various, Arian councils. We're mostly focusing on Athanasius at this point. But this council, like, I can read some of the creed and you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. The Holy Catholic Faith was published in the presence of our master, the most religious and glorious victorious emperor Constantius, Augustus, the eternal and august, in the consulate of the most illustrious, lists a couple other people, right? So that's some pretty nice things to say about the emperor. And this is in Sirmium on the 11th of June in 359 AD. We believe in one only true God, the Father Almighty, creator and framer of all things. So, that we believe in one only and true God, the Father. So to say that the Father is the only true God is a anti-Athanasian statement, even though it seems also relatively, inarguable. And in one only begotten Son of God, who before all ages and before all origin, and before all conceivable time, and before all incomprehensible essence, was begotten impassibly from God. So this Arian creed says that the begotten Son of God is begotten before all ages, before all time, and before all origin. So again, like what I'm saying is the Athanasians say that the Son is eternally begotten, and the Arians say that he's begotten before time. It's like, what exactly is the difference there? It takes an absolute lawyer to tell the difference between those two things. All right. And through whom the ages were disposed and all things were made, and him begotten as the only begotten, only from the Father, God from God, right? The Arians are perfectly happy to say that the Son of God is God from God, right? He's a divine person that comes from the true God.
True God from true God, consubstantial with the Father.
But they won't say true God from true God. That's one thing that Arians do not like to say, because there's only one who is true God. So they will say that the Son is God from God, a second God from the original God. But they won't.
I just wanted to introduce some orthodoxy into our discussion. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm telling you what the Arians actually think at this point in time. Like to his Father. So again, they're not going to say same substance as the Father. They will say he's like his Father, who begat him, according to the Scriptures, whose origin no one knows save the Father alone who begat him. We know that he, the only begotten Son of God, at the Father's bidding, came from the heavens for the abolishment of sin, was born of the Virgin Mary, conversed with the apostles, fulfilled the economy according to the Father's will, was crucified, died, descended into the lower parts of the earth, and regulated the things there, whom the gatekeepers of hell saw and shuddered. He arose from the dead the third day, conversed with the disciples, fulfilled all the economy, and when 40 days were full, ascended to the heavens, sits at the right hand of the Father, coming in the last day of the resurrection in the glory of the Father to render everyone according to his works. Right? So when it actually comes to the life of Jesus and the incarnation of Jesus, there isn't any daylight between the Arians and the Athanasians. Right? That middle part of the creed where it talks about Jesus doing all the things, there's nothing that a Orthodox Catholic would disagree with to this day. And in the Holy Ghost, whom the only begotten of God himself, Jesus Christ, had promised to send to the race of men, the Paraclete, yada, yada, yada. All right. But whereas the term essence, or homoousios, had been adopted by the fathers in simplicity, and gives offense as being misconceived by the people and is not contained in the scriptures, it has seemed good to remove it, and that it be never in any case used of God again, because the divine scriptures nowhere use it of the Father or the Son, but we say that the Son is like the Father in all things, as the Holy Scriptures teach. So that word homoousios, same substance, or consubstantial as it's often translated today, they say we're not going to use that word. It's not in the Bible. It's not in most of the tradition. It causes confusion and offense in the common people, so let no one use it again.
But
they didn't win. That didn't happen, did it?
Nope.
No, it did not. Yeah.
And I think, our next discussion, as we speak about, or maybe another discussion that interests me in our conversation here, Sam, is usually when the political power and the ecclesiastical power, right, come in and say, this is how it's going to be, usually that's how it is. But we still have a divided church.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So, one could look at Vatican I or Vatican II, and you have some complaining about, I just read the Vatican I, and it was against modernity, right? You have some, but when finally the magisterium, and when I say the magisterium, people say it's the Pope. No, it's the magisterium. It means the bishops writ large, which is what you have saying, no, substantial is out. We don't mention that word anymore.
We just say he's like his Father.
Right. But because you don't have a complete magisterium, what happens is you get other people saying, yeah, let's have another meeting.
Yeah. Because Constantius, this is popular in the East, but his control over the West is still not perfect. And
right.
Egypt is kind of under his control because he's appointed his puppet bishop in Alexandria. But Athanasius is still in hiding, and he still has all of his power and popular support.
Yeah.
And so you ask, how could the tide turn against the Arians? They just had a huge council, the biggest in history so far,
right,
where the emperor is there, the most holy, august, yada, 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 all of those sorts of things that they said about him. They issue a creed that fails to call the Son true God from true God and strikes out the word ousia from history, saying we shouldn't use this word anymore. So it seems like, what more could you want? It seems like this is going to carry the day.
Yeah, I mean, sort of like the old Brenner, so it shall be written, so it shall be done, right? We're done, but we're not done.
We're not done. All right.
And I mean, we still always have heresies bubbling up, okay? And that's a history of the church, whether it's Gnosticism, Pelagianism, monotism. We still have that, right? Where, the gifts of the Holy Spirit in the charismatic movement got a lot of evangelicals very, very nauseous and, very queasy. But this one sort of comes back. And I think our conversations, we need to finish up on Athanasius. Our next thing is teaching. But that eventually Athanasius' position on the Trinity won out is amazing to me because honestly, Sam, right now, in what 459? Is that where we're at right now?
459, yeah.
Athanasius looks like a big
He
loser.
looks like he's on the wrong side of history in 459.
Yeah, it looks like he's not in Alexandria. He's somewhere in the desert. Yeah, he might be undermining things here and there, right? So like Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Okay. All right.
Sort of like
He goes on his version of Truth Social, which nobody looks at it. Well, 5 million people in an echo chamber look at, but most people within the church say we're Arians. Okay, and they don't really say they're Arians. They're under bishops who say we're Arians.
Or they even those bishops don't like the word Arian to describe themselves.
Yeah. I think those bishops would say I'm doctrinal.
They just say we're Catholic. Arius was some priest who died 30 years ago. Who cares about him? We're just defending the Orthodox faith.
Yes.
And even actually this creed from Sirmium disagrees with some of Arius's individual points of theology.
Right.
Because Arius would often say there was a time when the Son was not, and that he was begotten after the ages, right? And this says it's begotten before all ages. Right. So this is actually, you might say, it's moderate Arianism is probably a better way to describe it.
Honestly, Sam, this interests me because we have three major characters in Trinitarian development. We have Paul Samosata, who's a huge loser. Let's be clear.
We actually we'll cover the biblical Unitarians aren't done, and actually at this council of
but right now they look like they're not even in the thought of any of the bishops.
They're in distant third place. Although we'll cover some of the bishops in the 4th century who were biblical Unitarians, but they're distant third place.
Right, they're distant. They're sort of like the Cubs right now. Okay, all right. Then you have the Arians. You have the Athanasians, what we call today doctrinal Trinitarianism, and we have the Arians that basically have the power of the throne and the power of the ecclesiastical movement. And it's going to be amazing. I think it's going to be amazing to me as I learn, and to everyone who's listening, how in essence, now, as a Catholic, I would say it's just the movement of the Holy Spirit putting things right. But I think, this is amazing because, man, I'm sure right now, if you're Athanasius in 459, you're not feeling very good about things.
No. All right. So
you have a bad reputation, right?
You've been condemned somewhere between 4 and 6 times.
You're not the friend of the emperor. He doesn't like you at all.
Yeah.
I'm surprised, by the way, given Athanasius' biography, that the emperor just said, you know what, off with your head.
Yeah. Well, he was wily enough to escape. He had a sense of how long he could stay and when it was time to get out of Dodge. He had a very good. You have to compliment Athanasius on being wily like a fox, knowing when to fight, knowing when to run, and doing both at the exact right time. So speaking of knowing when to fight and when to run. So 359 AD looks like the low point for Athanasius.
Yep.
All right. So now we have to get to how did he end up winning, right?
Why don't we do that in another episode?
All right.
Let's leave everybody hanging.
All right. I've got some readings about bishops being dragged, the corpses of bishops being dragged through Alexandria behind camels and then set on fire. So we'll start the next episode with the body of Bishop George of Cappadocia, the Bishop of Alexandria, being dragged behind a camel and then set on fire and desecrated while the
was it in Libya like Muammar Gaddafi?
Basically, yeah.
All right.
So, all right. Athanasius lives to fight another day.
You got it.